Thanks for joining us for the Fight for Your Marriage podcast with Charlyne and Lori. This is a place where you can find hope for your marriage through Jesus Christ. Hi, thanks for joining us for another episode of the Fight for Your Marriage podcast. I'm so glad that you're here with us today.
I'm so glad you're listening in. You will be blessed.
Well, today we have a great testimony to share with you. We are sitting down with Rhonda to hear her story of transformation and what God did in her marriage to Mike.
And when I hear your testimonies of restoration, it takes me back to when Bob and I had our restoration. It is something you will never forget, and it's something that you can share for the rest of your life to others who you may not even know have marriage problems within their walls of their house. So may I challenge you to pass these along to others and bless them and encourage them.
Well, today Rhonda's going to share her story and what God did in their home. Mike isn't able to join us today, but he gave Rhonda permission to tell the story of what God's done to their marriage. And I think it's going to be an encouragement to you. Sometimes I know that people can hear testimonies and it can be a discouragement. It can make you feel like that's not my story. And why are you making me wait so long, God? Why is that not my story? And I hope that as you hear the testimonies of people that we're sharing, that you will instead be reminded of the power that God has and what he can do in your marriage. If he's done it for them, he can do it for you. And so don't give up hope today. I hope this is a blessing to you and that Rhonda's story will be something that will just increase your faith as you listen to her testimony. Rhonda, thanks for joining us today. I'm glad that you are with us and able to share some of your restoration story and what God's done in your life, not only in restoring your marriage, but his faithfulness in the years that you were standing and praying for restoration. So tell us a little bit about yourself and about your marriage with Mike.
Gosh, we are coming up on 35 years being married. High school sweethearts, 2 kids, 1 grandbaby, 1 on the way. Just living life, enjoying it, and it feels like we went through about 6 or 7 years of just rough seas. And so it just feels, I'm feeling the calmness right now, and I'm just trying to enjoy it.
Well, that's good. Go back to when you had that rough patch in your marriage and what was going on then.
For probably 6-8 months, I didn't know what was wrong. I just knew something was wrong. I had my suspicions, obviously, but couldn't prove anything. Went away for a night with some friends, and I did what Charlyne says not to do, and I snooped. But I found out that he was having an affair, and so I was just in shock. I was really in shock because it's like I suspected but didn't believe that it could actually happen, and it was happening. And it was a week before my daughter's wedding, and so we just, had a meltdown in the hotel room, and we agreed to fake it for the next week until after the wedding. And he ended up ending it after like a couple of weeks, but it just didn't stick. And then I found out he was still talking to her, and so he left. And I still think I didn't grasp the depth of all of it. And, I obviously was praying and, believing, but he came home about 6 weeks later, and he wasn't ready to let it go. And I don't know that I was necessarily ready spiritually to deal with all of it either. Mm-hmm. So he ended up leaving again. And this time I knew, like, it was going to be darker. I knew it was going to be longer. And I kind of just put my armor on and I'm like, okay, here we go. I don't know what's happening, but, I had a friend give me your mom's devotion probably 6 months before I ever found out what was going on. And that's what I went back to, And
did you know back then that there was problems in your marriage, that things were not the way they should be?
Yeah. And that's why my friend sent it to me. I don't know where she even found it. I have no idea. God must have showed it to her.
Amen.
But, I went back to it and I, signed up for the devotions and I got them in the email every morning, and they were my lifeline. And once he left the second time, it's like I think that was God's way of saying, Kate, this is for you too. And you need to change. And I learned how to pray, and I learned how to fast. I learned the power of God, and I learned scripture. And I got together with my mom and a friend of mine. We got together once a week, and it started as just praying for Mike to come home, and then it just ended up, we just had a prayer meeting once a week for everything that we were all going through. And it was just weird because God would give one of us something and then the other one would confirm it, and it just was, there was so much of that through that whole time. And it just, my husband got deeper and deeper and darker and more unlike himself. I didn't recognize him, but I always knew, like, I've known him, since we were in high school. So I know who he is, and this was not it.
Did you know from the beginning that you wanted to pray and to stand for restoration? Or was there part of you that thought, he's been unfaithful to me, our marriage hasn't been going well for whatever length of time, I'm going to just move on?
Well, I think I told your mom last night, I think I was standing before I ever found out. I just didn't really know what I was doing.
Yeah.
And, the night I found out in the hotel room, I told him, I'm leaving. I hate you. I said things I shouldn't have said. I'll see you in divorce court. And I was done. To me, that was unforgivable. Right. And then I think I slept on it. And then the next morning, I don't know. All I can say is just God got a hold of me and he said, you're not done. I'm not done. And I told my husband that I loved him and I forgave him. And I was, I'm not giving up on us.
What was his reaction to that?
I don't really think he knew what to do with me at that point.
It's not the response he probably expected.
No, the response the night before is what he expected. And I think that justified a lot in his head. Well, she's mad and she's going to leave. Okay, right. I can do what I'm going to do. The loving, forgiving, praying wife, I don't think he knew what to do with me ever. So.
And that is like when I blew it and I divorced Bob and listened to the counselors and the pastor saying, he's never going to change. Bob's never going to change right now. And so the point is, we have to realize that I made a big mistake divorcing him because I listened to man and I didn't seek the Lord like you did before your divorce. I did it. The Lord wasn't getting my attention. I wasn't listening. I was listening to others instead of to the Lord. So, it's great how you found the Lord, before the divorce. And we praise the Lord.
Well, I had listened, and I had read a lot of your words before I ever found out. So I think I had that in my head in a sense, and then God was just reminding me of all of it. And
correct.
There were times I wanted to give up, of course.
Of course.
Everybody has that. So what did your journey look like as you started standing and praying for restoration? What was God doing in your life at that time?
Oh, gosh. I always hated the Old Testament. And it became my life source. just I think it just always was boring, but it just came to life, all the miracles and ways God came through and showed up for his people. And it's like, it just became real to me. And so I feel like God he showed me who I was. He showed me who he was. I heard from God like never before. I had never fasted. Food was my crutch.
Because you found that personal relationship that I've always prayed for everybody to get when they go to our website, to realize that they want and desire a personal relationship, that God does speak to us in so many different ways through reading the Bible. And I just say to people, read the New Testament. Just go through all the New Testament first, because I'm scared to send them to the Old Testament. But but once they start reading the New Testament, then they want to go to the Old Testament. Yeah. So they grow in the Lord.
Yeah.
Well, and I had been raised in church, so I had read I'd always read the New Testament, but I just never really read the Old Testament. And, so many stories out of the Old Testament just were like every time I got down or scared or, afraid that this is never going to end, I'd remember King Jehoshaphat and, Second Chronicles. I remember Gideon,
That's awesome.
I remember King David. Like, I just would remember how God came through for everybody. And I knew he promised, to come through for me too. And about 2 weeks after Mike left the second time, I got, I met with my friend who, she's a prayer warrior, and she gave me a word that God had given her, and that God was going to restore my marriage, but it was going to be a fight. And she referenced Nehemiah, rebuilding the wall, how they were praying with one hand and the sword in the other, rebuilding with one hand and the sword. And that was kind of my story. I just tried to remember that whenever I felt like it's not going to happen.
Did you have the support of other people besides your mom and a couple of friends that were supporting you and your kids even, or did they think that you were out of your mind for wanting this marriage to work?
Well, my son just has, he just has a heart that loves everybody. And so he, obviously struggled, and my kids were adults. Yeah. So, and they would ask me questions, and I was honest with them. And, my daughter struggled the most, and she just kind of didn't talk to my husband. She just couldn't do it. And, and he was trying to make excuses, and I know he loved them, but he was making excuses, and my daughter didn't want to hear it. So she just kind of ghosted him for most of it. And I know that was a big pull home for him, because my kids were really close with their dad. I mean, we were a close family before everything. So I know my husband missed that.
Yeah.
You know what he saw and God allowed was he saw the consequences of his sin. And then he didn't think of that before when he was in that sinful lifestyle. He did not realize what when you get caught or
even if you think of it before, so often you just choose the sin that's so fun.
Justify.
Right.
Exactly.
But when he feels it with his children and loses that relationship, that close relationship they had, now the Lord's turning the heat up on him to say, this is not supposed to be, you know. And there is a consequence.
Right.
Let alone your wife.
I think he
daughter.
thought, they were adults and it didn't matter anymore.
Right.
But there still is, he's still their dad. And so I think my kids, they loved me and they hated what I was going through, but they supported me, my mom and my friend. I had a couple of friends that supported me. Mike's family did not. They pretended to in the beginning, but they were just lying to my face because they were supporting it. And my husband lived with them while we were separated. And, they accepted the other woman. So,
yeah. How did that make you feel when you knew that they were accepting the other person like that?
My mother-in-law didn't surprise me.
Mm-hmm.
My father-in-law, it did, because I always looked to him as my father figure. And I thought they loved me. And when I found that out, it felt like they stabbed me in the back,
Yeah.
which they kind of did.
Mm-hmm.
But, um, you know, it it is what it is. I know they're broken people and they're enabling people too. So
Mm-hmm.
I doesn't surprise me that they enabled him to
Yeah, we've talked
do
about
it.
this in the past also, how
Yes.
it's so often, it's so hurtful when you're walking through it. But as the family members of the prodigal, they are now forced to choose. Do
Right.
I throw the prodigal out, this person, my son, my daughter, my brother, my sister, because they're bringing this other woman or other man around? Or do I try to show them unconditional love? Or if they're believers, am I witnessing to them it's a very tricky situation for the extended family members and for friends also. And you probably experience this as well. When you have friends and you've been married for 30 years and you're couple friends, and then you go through a separation or divorce, suddenly friends are choosing which spouse they're going to side with in it. And it's just such a tricky
Yeah.
situation, which just shows us that it's not just affecting two people or even
Oh
a
no.
husband and wife and your kids. It's affecting so many layers of people when we go through
Yeah.
this.
And may I
And I
remind
think,
people that there are people that literally turn around and don't know how to deal with that situation,
Right.
so that you lose friendships that you've had with the two of you together.
Right.
I know our friends struggled. Um, they didn't choose side. They tried not to choose sides. They tried to love us both. There were a couple of them that were angry and were having struggle deal with that. And then, friends and on the others, that weren't in our small friend group, but, and he was probably the only friend Mike had that said, you need to go home and make things right with your
Good for
family. He
him.
really only had one person, one friend that told him that. Everybody else just, hey, we want you to be happy, whatever makes you happy.
And what was Mike's reaction to that friend telling him that he should go home?
Oh, he knew.
Yeah.
But he also tried to avoid him a lot,
Yeah.
because when you're in the middle of that ugliness and the darkness, you don't want to hear it.
Mm-hmm.
Mike has said too, like, he never, as much as he tried to ignore it, he never stopped hearing God telling him to go home.
Mm-hmm. I was just going to
So
ask you, what was Mike doing in his spiritual walk while he was away from home and involved with this other person? Was he walking with the Lord, battling with the Lord, trying to show up at church, or what was he doing?
he was more battling with the Lord,
Mm-hmm.
battling against what his flesh wanted and what he knew God was telling him to do. And I know towards the end, probably a month or so before he came home, he did go back to therapy, and he did go to church a couple times on his own, and he did go with me once or twice while we were separated. So,
Mm-hmm.
he knew.
Was he open as the time went on that you all were apart? Was he open to talking to you about coming home, or was he adamant that he was not going to be coming back home to this marriage?
There was a point about 5 months before he came home that he sat me down and said, stop praying for me. I'm never coming home. And I knew at this point, now I know he was planning on, a life with the other woman and
Mm-hmm.
trying to make things more solid for the two of them. And, at the time I told him, I love you. I know what God promised me, and I'll never stop praying for you.
Mm-hmm.
So sorry.
Were you steadfast in your resolve at that point to, as long as
Oh
this was
yeah.
going to take, I'll be here waiting?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I told him that. I said, the door's open when you're ready.
Mm-hmm.
And there did come a point around Christmas that was kind of I felt the shift. He ended up coming to Christmas Eve service with me at church. And he told me that night, like, that God was talking to him.
Mm-hmm.
And he goes, I'm trying to get home. I just don't know how to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, please don't give up on me. So in a matter of 2 months, it went from stop praying for me, I'm never coming home, to please don't give up on me, I'm trying.
I think that's so huge that he said that to you.
So huge.
Because
Yeah,
so many people
about fell
don't
over.
hear. Yeah, I bet. So many people don't hear it, but the prodigals are feeling that way because they're battling behind the scenes and just, with one foot in each world, like they're in this sin world. And for the ones that have a personal relationship with Christ, they know that what they're doing is wrong. And so I hope that encourages people that hear that, because they may not actually hear their prodigals say that. But I guarantee there's a lot of prodigals that are walking through that and feeling that. And also shame. We talk about shame a lot. If he had the
Guilt and shame.
Right. The shame for what he was doing.
A lot.
Yeah.
He dealt with that for a long time after he came home. Even,
right. Yeah.
Because the enemy, it's constantly rewinding to them all the badness of what they did, to remind him to come back to his side of the world. And so there is still a battle when they start to talk about even saying the sentence that, what he said to you is a huge victory in heaven that day, because he spoke it to you. He admitted it, and you're wondering and waiting, and you don't know how long that time will be. And but when they say it, you now have those words, so it even stirs up you to pray more, fast more, that you see God is moving and answering your prayers. And that is tremendous for our standards, especially if they've not had a close walk with the Lord or reading the Bible regularly. They're growing in the Lord, and then they see God move. And that movement is huge. I can remember when Bob would have weekends with the other woman, and I would pray all weekend, fasting and praying that God would.
I prayed hard on the weekends.
I agree.
So what happened when that shift started to happen then around Christmas? Did that continue, or was that the start of just more time away?
It was, he came home about 2 months after that.
Okay.
So, but I feel like, the battle was, the enemy was amping up his game for sure. And it was a struggle. It was a back and forth. It was, I was, I feel like too, every time I wanted to give up, I would pray. And there were times where, I wrote a letter, I'm releasing you. But God never and I know God was wanting me to write the letter, but I never gave it. He never let me give it to him. So God always had a way of, renewing my hope when it was gone.
So how did Mike come home? What finally happened that brought him home?
Well, my son and I went to Montana to visit my daughter. And, he's seeing pictures and he's not there. And right before we left on that trip, a really good friend of his passed away. And he actually went to the funeral while me and my son were away. And that man's kids got up, and spoke about their dad and talked about the legacy that he left for them. And it just stabbed my husband in the heart, because he was like, what legacy am I leaving for my kids if I divorce my wife, And I probably a couple of days later, I was still there. It was the night before we were driving home from Montana. He texted me at like midnight and said, it's over. I ended it and I'm coming home.
Were you shocked?
And I'm in Montana, so I was dying because I wanted to be home so fast. And we still had 2 days before we were home. But it just was kind of it was my suddenly.
Yeah.
Happened.
It was.
And, it didn't end there, Unfortunately. He did come home, and the contact was still there. You know, she was not going to give up easily.
I
She tried
totally
everything
understand.
in her power.
Let's talk about that for a minute, because restoration is literally just the first step to the new start of the journey. And we want people to understand that's not when you let up on praying and fasting, but really when you even amp it up more to stay in the Word and praying for your marriage, because you've been there and you know what the enemy can do. So how did your husband respond to the battle between this other woman wanting him to come back to that relationship? Because there's also a grieving that happens especially when 100%. You cut something off that quickly, you know, emotionally they have to get over this other person. So how did that happen in your house?
Well, I know, you know, she wasn't giving up and she kept contacting him, and he would try and he would go a day or so and then he would give in and talk to her. And, you know, it was just a struggle for like 3.5, 4 months. And then I knew, and then he would talk about it, and then he would say, well, she said this. And I'm like, well, why are you talking to her? And, you know, it was just, I think back at that time, and it was so heavy.
Now, did you have any boundaries that you both set up ahead of time about communication with her, or did you just go into it thinking you'll let him figure out how to handle the communication?
Honestly, I don't know what I was thinking. I was just so glad he was home, and I just, you know, I knew it wasn't going to be easy, right. And I, you know, was trying to figure out, you know, how do I pray now he's home? Before It was all day. My stuff was out all over the table. You know, I had to learn to pray in private again. And I don't even know. I just feel like I was flailing through those months and just trying to trust that God was going to finish what he started, you know?
So was that a false start, or did he finally end communication with her?
He ended up meeting her one last time. Mm-hmm. And I think in his heart at that time, or in his head, whatever, he was going to leave me again. Mm. But I was going to a prayer meeting that night to pray for him. And I knew in my spirit something was wrong and off. And we prayed that night, and let's just say God was going to be heard that night. Mm-hmm. And I ended up FaceTiming him, which I don't ever do. And she heard the conversation, and she lost her mind, and she ended up calling me. And I mean, I knew I wasn't surprised. But I think in my husband's, and, you know, he was always a really strong person, always one of the strongest people I knew. And so this was just really weird. But I think that shifted again that night, because he said, into himself, later told me his conversation to himself was, I'm either going to leave or I'm staying for good. I can't do this back and forth anymore. Yeah. And I mean, we literally checked in with each other probably once an hour. Every hour we checked in with each other for a couple of weeks. Are you good? Yeah. I'm good. You know, like that's how delicate it was.
Yeah. The role that our counselor that we went to, he said, Bob, if you ever pick up the phone or you ever see her, or she follows you to work and waits outside at the end of the day to see you and talk to you, you have to tell Charlyne. That's the rule. You have to tell her, and then keep that doorway open and admit it, and then say, you got to help me. And you got to keep praying for me, because this is not easy breaking this off, and she's not accepting it. So we do have these relationships that have started, or there may be a non-covenant marriage that we're talking to today that's listening to this. And we want to say to them, God doesn't give up. God doesn't give up. No. And regardless of your circumstances, he will lead you through it to victory.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you saw a shift in those couple of weeks, and then did that solidify what was happening in your restoration after you made it through those first couple of hard weeks?
I would say it was probably the first hard year
Yeah.
after
Mm-hmm.
after he came home. It was probably a good year before, I didn't trust him. And, he had gone back and forth for so long that I didn't trust that it was sticking this time.
Mm-hmm.
And, I was so busy trying to control everything and control him and make sure he wasn't talking to her. And I wasn't controlling myself.
Yeah.
I wasn't letting God handle him.
Right.
And he used to tell me all the time, he said, Rhonda, you prayed and battled and believed God to bring me home, and he brought me home, and now you're not trusting him to keep me here.
Wow.
And I would be like, don't you preach to me.
Guilty.
But he was so true. He saw your difference.
Oh, it's absolutely true.
He saw the difference.
Absolute truth. Absolutely. So I mean,
how has God changed both of you since then?
We are just not the same people.
Yeah.
What a praise.
COVID hitting forced us to stay home and face each other, and we couldn't, you couldn't go do anything. So we were just stuck together.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a lot of really, really, really good, deep conversations that year that started a lot of healing in us. And I mean, our marriage, I would have said before all of this, like, we had a really, really good marriage, but there was a level I didn't know we hadn't achieved until now. And I feel like we have a better marriage now than we've ever had, ever.
That's amazing.
And that's what happened to Bob
years.
and I. And that's the truth. When you do get it restored and you work through it and go through the pain and suffering of forgiving him. And that's the key word that I would like to mention is forgiveness, that we have to keep forgiving over and over till the Holy Spirit gives it to you. It's just, that you've forgiven him or that other person. And forgive the other person, because that person is deceived, blinded. They may not know the Lord, or they've been a Christian and they've walked away from their marriage, but due to temptation from the enemy. So we need to continue to pray for that marriage. And I met with the other woman, and that is something that some people will have that experience. And you can say to them, I'm praying for you, and I'm praying for your husband and your children, for your family to be restored. So, we want to be able to say that we have to be bold and loving. And to have that meeting with her was very key to our relationship being restored, because I spoke from my heart to her that God's best is their marriage for the children, for her. Just share my brief testimony of how God spoke to me. So, God can use, and so many people have different scenarios, but God wants these marriages restored. And that other person is not our enemy as much as they need to get saved and have their family restored, like you and I. That God can heal their marriage. And we have to give them hope and keep praying for them to have that happen to them.
I mean, I think after reading all your books, I did start praying for her and her marriage, and because she never did leave her husband. She was married and living with him the whole entire time. And I always prayed that God would keep her there and that her husband wouldn't give up on her. And I don't know what their marriage is like. I have no idea. And I never met with her. I'm not sure how that would have ended, but the day after they met and my husband finally ended it, we had a very brief texting conversation. And I did tell her then, that I pray that we would heal from this, and that her and her husband would heal, and that our families would heal. And I, hopefully that got through. I don't know.
But you said it, and the Lord, you were obedient to say that to her, and to have that peace that you were saying to her, blessing instead of, cursing, and that you were sharing the Lord, that God can do it,
Yeah.
Your
And,
testimony is powerful for other people
yeah,
looking at you too.
yeah. And I mean, I know I, from things Mike has said to me that, I was always a threat to her. You
Mhm.
know, she knew I was praying. I'm sure she knew I wasn't giving up. And, she knew that my kids and our home and our family was always a pull. So I know our family was always a threat to her, and she hated that.
Correct. And
Yeah.
that's true,
Yeah.
positively.
Well,
Yeah.
Rhonda, what is God doing in your family now with your extended family, your kids, and how is God changing the relationships since your marriage has been restored?
I mean, my husband and I are just, we're enjoying each other, and
Mhm.
we're, living, we're trying to not ever take it for granted, and trying to be intentional with each other, and plan date nights and stuff like that. And, our kids, my husband has said so many times, like, 'cause my daughter went through a really rough time,
Mhm.
and he said, I needed to be here for that. God knew I needed to be here for that. He knew I needed to be here for my granddaughter.
Yeah.
Like, we have grandkids now,
Mhm.
and even his family, like, I had to forgive them, and
Right.
they never apologized, but they're his family, and I needed to forgive them
That's important. Mhm.
regardless.
Right.
And it took a while to restore some of the family relationships. It took
Mhm.
a while, but God has restored all of them.
That's great.
There's not one that's not restored.
That's great.
So it's just been, sometimes I just can't even believe my life. Sometimes it's just like, it just reminds me how good God is.
Okay, well, let me ask you a loaded question then. On the other
Okay.
side of this, would you have changed going through this to see how God changed you in the process and changed your marriage? Would you have, obviously, you probably wouldn't have picked it up and chosen to do it, but now that you've been through it, do you see how God used it for his glory and to change your family?
Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
we both have, because we still have our conversations, and we
Yes.
still talk about things, and we both always say, like, as much as we hate what we went through, God has brought so much good from it.
Hmm.
He's just It's just a miracle. It
Yeah.
really is a miracle. And no, I hated it. Don't ever want to go through it again, but I would do it all over again if I
Yeah.
had to have what we have today, 100%.
Yeah.
And I agree.
Mhm.
I agree. And you sharing today to others is just another chapter, the beginning of another chapter in your book. You're able to share with more people and be able to say, it's worth standing, it's worth praying, it's worth fighting for your family, for your children,
Yeah.
and all. And I love that you had a relationship that was torn when you're with your in-laws, but I love hearing that is restored as it was with Bob and I with my in-laws.
Well, God
It
did a big miracle in your family.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did. And I will never take that for granted, ever.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing your story with us today. And maybe next time we'll have Mike on with you. And I know that you are not done standing and fighting for your marriage. I'm sure you're probably, like my mom has said, once a stander, always a stander. So you got to stay in that fight. And now you're
Yeah.
going to be the one sharing with other people that devotional when their marriage starts to hit the hard times to say, hey,
Oh,
there's
I've
hope.
sent it to a lot of people.
Yeah. There's
That's
hope.
awesome. That's what you need to do. Proclaim it.
Yep.
That's awesome. And your husband may not be as bold as you are, but in time, when he has a man at work, I think if he started hearing that somebody was unfaithful, I think that we need to pray that he would speak to him privately and say, don't make the mistake I made,
Yeah.
or share his
Oh,
story.
yeah. He's done it one-on-one. He's not in the broadcasting.
And that's
He's
okay.
not ready to broadcast it for the world.
That is okay.
That is fine,
So,
but your
yeah.
testimony is still, everybody has seen you two separately and all what God did and individually with both of you and your children and your in-laws and so forth. So we love the testimonies because God gets the glory and honor on it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for being with us, Rhonda. We really appreciate it. And
I appreciate you guys. I appreciate your ministry. And, I told you on the phone the other day, like I had God's words and Bob and Charlyne's words, and that's what got us through.
That's great.
If we can help you in any way, we invite you to visit the website of Rejoice Marriage Ministries at www.rejoiceministries.org. Thanks for joining us today as we proclaim that God heals hurting marriages.